Well, it is time to begin, so we shall begin. Welcome to the Gonzaga Socratic Club in a new series that we are starting tonight. The Socratic Club was founded, I think, 18 years ago. It's been around for a while. It's been around on campus. It gets its name. The name is very confusing to people. We get the name, though, from the Oxford Socratic Club, which was presided over by famous author and Christian apologist C.S. Lewis at Oxford in the mid-1900s. And the Oxford Socratic Club was started as an organization to provide a forum for people who are interested in questions, really broadly speaking, about Christianity, the Christian worldview, and philosophy. And it housed, it hosted a pretty amazing series of talks by very famous intellectuals at the time, including Christian thinkers and philosophers, theologians, atheists, all across the map. And we, at the Gonzaga Socratic Club, takes its motto from the Oxford Socratic Club to follow the argument wherever it leads. So what that means is philosophical inquiry into important things is our basic reason for existence. As I said, we're starting a new series this fall on human nature. Universities sponsored by the Society of Jesus, including Gonzaga, have made the study of human nature foundational to the intellectual formation of students, and indeed to the entire project of doing philosophy in a Jesuit vein. Through addressing questions of human nature, meaning, and purpose, philosophy of human nature provides a foundation for the philosophical studies of the core curriculum, and also, broadly speaking, a context for the disciplinary studies across the university. Many of the professors who teach philosophy of human nature at Gonzaga take a survey approach that considers a variety of positions on the questions of human nature. That approach highlights the philosophical character of Philosophy 201 by encouraging students to critically examine and explore possible answers to the questions posed by human nature about soul and body and intellect and humans and animals and humans and God and so forth, and encourages students to explore possible answers to these questions in the light of their own experience. But that often means that professors who teach philosophy of human nature end up taking a good bit of time presenting the views of other thinkers. And so I thought that it might be a helpful thing for the Socratic Club to provide a forum for professors to go a little deeper on their own positions on human nature. And that's the idea behind the Socratic Club Human Nature series that will be looking at different perspectives on human nature. We start tonight with two, broadly speaking, evolutionary perspectives on human nature, both from colleagues of mine in the philosophy department here at Gonzaga who teach human nature or teach issues that impact or connect with human nature, at the very least. Dr. Mark Alfino will be presenting on cultural evolution with the title of a talk, Human Nature Comes from Nature. And Father Tim Clancy of the Society of Jesus will follow that up with a presentation on human and technology coevolution. And I'm hoping that the basic format we have in mind is that each of them will present individually. Well, I think it might be interesting to allow for a little bit of back and forth between the two of them. And then in keeping with the approach of the Socratic Club, we'll have time for questions and discussion at the end. So I want to especially thank the two speakers for tonight, Dr. Alfino and Father Clancy, for kicking off this series. And we'll start with Dr. Alfino then.
see the live audience. Wonderful. And a little tough. So let's see if I can get out from behind here. So it's going to transcribe everything I say like that? Is that right? That's really funny. Do we need that? Is that optional? Okay. Okay, great. Maybe I can stand out here and maybe project a little better. I'm going to read this, so you're all looking a little fuzzy at the moment, but I think it'll be fine. Gosh, it's been a while since we've done this kind of thing. It's great. Thanks for coming out. Okay. So for most of human history, if you wanted to know about human nature, you would visit a philosopher or a philosopher. And now our role is really collaborative. And that's because it's really the evolutionary sciences that have offered the best answers, the answers that can be considered knowledge to the question, where did we come from and how did we come to be as we are? There's still plenty of honest work for philosophers to do, but we are no longer the sole authorities. So I'm not here to present my theory of human being, but rather the theory that most researchers, philosophers or not, consider the most well-confirmed and widely accepted view of human nature we have ever had, the theory that we have evolved from nature. Now, in fairness to my profession, I should point out that philosophers don't just study theories that are true. We speculate a lot, and we study views of human nature for many reasons. Sometimes we study theories because we find them interesting or insightful, or they help us understand the time period of the theory. Sometimes we study theories because they are connected to our faith commitments. I think Father Clancy will be offering such a speculative theory tonight, but we'll have to wait and see. We've been emailing a bit ahead of the meeting, and that's been very enjoyable. I think he's using evolution more as a metaphor, as we often do in cultural interpretation, rather than the way the theory actually works. Like poets, philosophers can sometimes create theory from imagination. That has produced some great and insightful philosophy. But we should be careful in distinguishing those approaches which might use the word evolution productively from theories that can be considered knowledge. Evolution is not just one interpretation among others. It is what we know to be true today. I want to pause at this moment because I was thinking about our exchange, and I just want to take a minute, since we have a live audience and we're back to this, to acknowledge my tremendous respect for my friend, Father Clancy. He was one of the first people I fell into conversation with when I arrived here in 1989. And in spite of, or because of my Catholic upbringing, complete with a tour of duty as an altar boy, if you can imagine, Father Clancy's been explaining things Catholic and Jesuit to me ever since I got here. So if you could help me express some gratitude to Father Clancy. I just realized as we were exchanging our views that I owed you a debt of gratitude. Okay, let's get started by recalling some of the things you know about evolution from biology class, which typically focuses on genetic evolution. You probably remember that heritable traits, genetic variation, and selection are basic evolutionary processes. And they are. Variations or mutations occur in genes naturally. Many are neutral or negative for our fitness, but some are positive. It helps to think of selection as a mathematical relationship mapping one generation of a population of organisms onto another. Organisms that do better at meeting the selection pressures of their environment are better represented in the successor generation, and their genes are better represented too. As we'll see, roughly the same thing happens in cultural evolution, but the processes do not necessarily involve genetic mechanisms. So that was the story you got in high school or college, and it's the truth. However, evolutionary theories become much broader in recent decades, including evolutionary psychology, cognitive anthropology, and cultural evolution. And some long-standing theoretical disputes in biology have been resolved or set aside. We now have better theories about how evolution shapes our psychology and social behaviors through individual and kin selection, how reciprocal altruism evolved, and how selection operates on many levels: genetic, epigenetic, phenotypic, and in humans especially through culture and neogroup selection. The expansion of evolutionary theory to multi-level selection theory has been one of the most exciting stories I've followed in my career and very consequential for philosophy. Today, I want to tell you specifically how cultural evolution holds the key to understanding our human nature. I'll say more about cultural evolution in about 2 minutes, but first I want to caution against a few misunderstandings about scientific theories and evolution in particular. First, some philosophers still believe that if you accept a scientific theory as true, you have suddenly become something called a naturalist, or worse, a materialist, whatever that could mean today. The idea that science involves a prior or implicit commitment to a metaphysics is pretty much nonsense, in my opinion. However, scientific theories do have implications for our beliefs. For example, if evolution is true, then Aristotle is wrong about the species never changing. That's an implication relationship between a scientific theory and some other belief we might have. But if God suddenly stepped off an international flight at SeaTac, evolution would still be true. It might be the end of faith, depending upon what God did next, but evolution would still be true. And if God said evolution didn't happen, he'd have to explain why, contrary to the appearances. So to point out places where we might make this mistake, I will preface a point by saying whatever else might be true, ... And by that phrase, I mean both that we may discover new truths that qualify our current theories, as quantum mechanics qualifies Newtonian physics, but also that some things we believe as a matter of faith may or may not be true, but they do not affect the truth of the things we really do know, like evolution. A second problem relates more directly to evolutionary theory, and specifically to two mistakes people often make in thinking about evolution. First, some people think that if evolution is true, then everything comes down to a struggle for existence, a fight of all against all, nature red in tooth and claw, as the saying goes. And looking at the animal kingdom, it often does. But if you only think of evolution that way, you might conclude that human meanings and human culture, especially refined culture like the arts, cannot be part of evolution because they seem to have nothing to do with a struggle for existence. Many philosophers in the 19th century, lacking our knowledge of evolution, made this inference. They divided knowledge of nature from knowledge of spirit, Naturwissenschaft versus Geisteswissenschaft. But the truth is that whatever else might be true, culture emerged from nature in humans. Geisteswissenschaft came later in the record. Moreover, evolution doesn't always involve a struggle for existence. It often produces instances of symbiosis, equilibrium states like stable cooperation, and it sometimes produces complex structures like our very big brains. Oh, that's the family tree. We'll come back to that. These are very big brains. Because of this, we can take more cognitive approaches to evolutionary challenges like kin selection, which other animals solve by more hardwired methods like smell. Second, people have an irresistible desire to believe that evolution is teleological. That is, it has a direction on its own. Such theories cannot be serious contenders to be part of evolutionary theory. Evolution is a set of processes and mechanisms that respond to change. We may one day gain control of these processes and direct our own evolution, but that would be an achievement. That would be an accomplishment in spite of the processes themselves. I'm aware of zero evidence that evolution itself has a telos. So if there is some, I hope to learn what that is. We will see later in the talk why such evidence is very unlikely. So to our topic, what is cultural evolution and how do broader cultural processes emerge from and participate in our evolution? Well, let's start with some textbook examples. First, cultures that could get nutrition from dairying can confer a fitness advantage on individuals whose genes express the allele for lifelong digestion of lactose. Within a few thousand years, very short time in evolution, about 80% of people in a dairy culture will have that allele. By contrast, about 80% of people in non-dairy cultures are lactose intolerant because they have the other allele. Cultural evolutionists Second, cultural evolution is studying an Inuit-speaking tribe around 1000 in the Christian era. have found evidence that their superior meat-sharing norms led to their expansion within a few hundred years across modern-day Alaska and the Canadian Arctic, replacing existing peoples. Another example is that different cultures have had different experiences with COVID virus due to their specific packages of cooperation or non-cooperation. In this case, we're seeing the effects of cultural transmission. Cultures that promote, for example, cultures that promote patriotism or encourage celibacy and altruism in religious orders effectively get a group fitness advantage at the cost of the fitness of those patriots and religious who sign up. Whatever else might be true, human cultures invented specific types of religion, which altered our evolution in important ways. For example, cultures that developed beliefs in moralizing gods and contingent afterlives were able to grow larger cities and larger and more stable cities, overcoming the problem of strangers living together. More recently, from about 600 AD to the Renaissance, Catholic Church changed norms for marriage, family life, and inheritance that altered our psychology profoundly, moving us away from kin-based institutions and making us more impersonally pro-social, sensitive to impartial rules, and more patient, among many other mental adaptations. Some cultural evolutionists argue that these changes led to the kind of market mentality that made capitalism possible. The most likely hypothesis for mechanism here is cultural transmission, not genetic change. The Reformation produced a culture of literacy that has measurable effects today, even in direct distance from Wittenberg. Even the colonies of Protestant countries have higher literacy rates than the colonies of Catholic countries. Moreover, literacy changes our brains in real time as we become readers, an example of neuroplasticity. But it does not change us genetically in any way. That's cultural transmission. Okay, so notice about these examples that in all but the first example, the selection effects are effects of cultural transmission, not genetic change. The philosopher Daniel Dennett argued in the 90s that Darwin's really dangerous idea was that evolution could be substrate neutral. Genes are one substrate, ideas and information, stuff of culture, are another. As long as the process repeats itself, variation, pressure, selection, we have a potential evolutionary environment. Notice also the lack of guarantees in both genetic and cultural evolution. The bigger cities made possible by moralizing religions raised bigger armies and flourished in the short run. But empires also fall apart when they exceed the limits of their institutions and values. Innovations in agriculture, a major form of human culture, enhanced fitness temporarily, leading to population spikes followed by food scarcity and famine. Markets produced wealth in the short run and climate change in the long run. Will we find new cooperative norms for international cooperation on climate change before it's too late? Stay tuned. Nature delivers her verdicts after the fact. That's selection. This is a big reason why teleological interpretations of evolution have not succeeded. They go against the way nature does her work. It is also a reason why we should give our full attention to the problem of climate change. We have a bias toward thinking we are headed to a better place. Now you might be thinking, okay, some cultural processes are part of evolution, but surely not everything that happens in culture is affecting our reproductive fitness. And you'd be right. As with our biology, many cultural processes are neutral to our fitness or promote our fitness indirectly. And with many others, it's probably impossible to know. I have no idea if TikTok has anything to do with our fitness. Culture is as extravagant in its production as the peacock's plumage. As you might recall, sexual selection can produce extravagant displays like the peacocks, which are objective hindrances except for the fact that they indicate fitness. Likewise, people in fitness cultures, like ours, buff themselves up at the gym, not because their environments require peak physical fitness, but because it's a way to signal fitness to others. And being fit feels good anyway. One of the most extravagant things about us is our really very, very large brains, which have more than tripled in size in 6 million years. We don't just use those brains to select mates and friends. We also use them to monitor our own behavior and reputations and to participate in social networks that may affect our fortunes. We use them to represent ourselves to one another. Whatever else might be true, we use our big brains to create and recreate our gods and our faiths. The New Testament loving God went viral, as Rodney Stark famously showed in The Rise of Christianity. And why not? But there is something else that we do with our human culture that may not look relevant to evolution until we take a closer look. And this is probably the most radical idea I have for you tonight. We use cultural productions like movies, books, music, and art, even fashion and body art, to tell and retell our personal stories and others' stories in order to represent not only our current selves, but new versions of what it means to be human. So we have normalized some taboos like miscegenation, uncovered false beliefs about men and women and sexuality, and we've expanded the circle of human beings to include people who were only recently thought of as property. Human culture is an open-ended project of understanding and imagination. Sometimes in this process, new ideas of ourselves take hold. Suddenly we shift our faith to a God who loves us. Closer to Earth, consider the idea that we have rights. It's only a few hundred years old, but it's clearly changed the fitness landscape by favoring those who can control their impulses to violence and by creating expectations of accountability from government that never existed before. At the personal level, we no longer see dueling as an honorable way to settle disputes. Ritual personal violence of the kind that the culture of dueling provided and even honored is kind of out of style. A gentleman or a gentle person is now someone who declines invitations to personal violence. At a social level, when rights cultures incarcerate violent offenders, they're clearly reducing their fitness. That's a good reason to take incarceration decisions very seriously. So I'd like you to think of cultural evolution as a coin with two sides. On one side, we're using our current set of cultural ideas to enforce norms and follow a cultural game plan for success. We call it the status quo. But on the other side of the coin, we're generating alternatives to the status quo, proposing new norms and recognizing new ideas of what it is to be human. Culture does some heavy lifting for us. Within my lifetime, for example, we have finally come to accept that gay and lesbian couples love each other and can be parents, make good parents. Think about how many stories, movies, protests, political campaigns, how much research went into that result. In culture, we throw up competing views about our most basic existential concerns, and then we advocate them as the best ways to thrive, survive, and thrive. In this sense, culture produces variation analogous to mutations in genetic evolution. Culture includes transmissible beliefs and practices, variation, and selection effects. The selection effect in this case occurs when we normalize the new idea and change our attitudes toward people who don't get on board. We do this informally through gossip, shunning, and shaming, and formally through institutions, including public prosecution. And that, the selection effect, is a very good reason to be careful about all of those practices. Before I conclude, I'd like to give you an idea of how cultural evolution changes philosophical problems. At the start of my career, we used to think of cultural relativism only as the randomizing effect of the myriad contingent factors that shape human beings and their cultures over time. Cultures are indeed deeply contingent, like life itself. But culture looks a lot less random now. In light of cultural evolution, cultures are best described as relatively functional or dysfunctional systems for meeting existential challenges. Cultures help us solve some basic problems of existence: who to be intimate with, who to trust, who to cooperate with, what's fair, when to resist hierarchy, what to do with rule breakers, and how to keep oneself healthy and pure and avoid unhealthy people. Once we see cultures as functional systems that work on existential problems, the nature of ethics and politics starts to look very different. Instead of a search for the essence of moral goodness, ethics looks more like the problem of how members of a partially social species can survive and thrive in societies with different political orientations. Politics looks less like an ultimate contest of ideologies and more like a fountain of proposals about how to deal with existential challenges. With the growth of physiopolitics, the study of biological markers for political orientation, we're understanding that political differences are reliably produced in populations, not quite like eye color, but sort of. So don't keep waiting for conservatives and liberals to vanquish each other in argument. Cultural evolution tells us that what's more likely is that the political cultures that make good use of the natural diversity of perspectives in humans will do better than cultures that don't. Frankly, better than political cultures like ours today in the United States, which seem sometimes to be on a death march of non-cooperation. Instead of pretending that there is some choice to be made among ideal ethical theories or between conservatives and liberals, we should ask, for example, how well are we using our differences to get along with each other? The question, will we be able to cooperate enough to address climate change, becomes more salient than the question, is virtue ethics or utilitarianism the best theory? And frankly, that question is starting to sound to me like, which is a better tool, a screwdriver or a hammer? I suspect philosophers will soon stop asking these questions about ideal ethical theories, and in fact, many have. So cultural evolution highlights a kind of sea shift, I think, in philosophical thinking about ethics and politics. In closing, I'd like to add two details. First, not every version of human nature that we can imagine can be realized. Dennett invited us to think of evolution as a design space within which we make moves. These moves are what I've been calling proposals. Some moves, like collectivism and communism, have been tried without success. In fact, they've led to dictatorships. Maybe the failure of collectivism means that you can't get there from here. That is, you can't get to those human beings that you imagined from these that you have to work with. Or maybe it just means that you can't get there yet. In culture, especially contemporary free speech culture, the floor is always open to proposals. You just have to win adherence. Second, both genetic and cultural evolution are historical theories. The study of history is in a bit of decline in popularity right now, but cultural evolution shows us how important it is. Just as we study our genome to know who we've been and to control our biological destiny, so also our cultural histories hold clues to our next best moves in evolutionary design space. As a philosophical perspective, cultural evolution demystifies our human nature without reducing it to something else. It encourages us to speculate about who we might become without letting us forget where we've been, and without letting us forget that we have come from nature. The illusion that we stand apart from nature, an illusion captured in the old faiths, philosophies, and ideologies, might be as dangerous for us as a virus. Evolution tells us that human being comes from nature and that we have to earn our success one generation at a time. God help us. Thanks for your attention. I look forward to your comments and questions. I'm not sure how to do it. Oh, there we go. Great.
Father Clancy. I also have a quasi-prepared text. It's not as sharp as I'd like it to be, but it's at least a start. I want to situate how I teach human nature within the history of my being at Gonzaga and teaching human nature, because how I've taught it has changed in different ways over the years. So when I started teaching human nature, which was back in 1982, if you can believe it, where it was part of my Jesuit training In the Jesuits, we study philosophy, and then we do some field work for a few years, and then we study theology, and then we do whatever further studies we need to do. So after I studied philosophy here, I went and got an MA in philosophy at Loyola Chicago, so I could come back and teach philosophy here for my field work. So I taught philosophy here for 3 years, from 82 to 85. And human nature was kind of my cornerstone course. Because I took it as, well, if you had, a semester, what would you want people to look at? So I took my inspiration from a quote from Virginia Woolf, that truth is to be had by lying together many varieties of error. So this is the insight that all theories begin with an insight that really sheds light on some particular question, problem, issue. But of course, the theory wants to extend that insight to other questions, problems, issues. And as the theory extends to other phenomena, further and further from the home phenomenon from which it started, the theory can often start to feel a little forced. So my approach to theories of human nature isn't to ask which is true, but to ask how true, in what circumstances, for what purposes, addressing what questions. So a theory might be very helpful in one context that would be totally useless in another context. Kind of the basic insight. In other words, when it comes to the truths of human nature, I tend to think more in analog terms than in digital terms. I tend to think more in terms of more true versus less true than true, false. What I did in that course is I conjugated human nature in 4 voices. In other words, I argued there are 4 basic orientations by which you can understand reality and your experience. And I took it from how we conjugate verbs. So I think there's a first-person voice, there's a second-person voice, there's a third-person voice, and then there's an objective or impersonal orientation. And so what I did in my human nature course is I started by taking an objective systems approach to the study of human nature, and I used Freud, because Freud was very, he was just everywhere. He was very popular. He was just everywhere. From critical theory to literary theory to psychology, to advertising, to all kinds of things. So I started, and Freud has a causal model, and it is a system. So I used that as an example of an objective approach to human behavior, seeing it in formal terms as a systematic exchange of psychic energy and bundles of energy and catharses and cathexes and all this stuff. I then turned to a third person, impartial, detached observer, scientific approach to human nature. And there I leaned on evolutionary psychology. I then looked at a first-person orientation, where you seek to understand the behavior, not impartially, looking for patterns in data, but by empathetically, by trying to understand the motives for somebody doing what they do and how the world appears to somebody who's acting this way, right? So that's basically phenomenology, and I looked at existentialism as an example of a first-person approach. So whereas Freud thought that freedom is an illusion, existentialism starts with freedom as a fact, an unavoidable fact. Right? Neither of these are scientific positions. They're methodological presuppositions that you bring to how you're trying to understand your experience. I then end with my favorite view, which is a second person intersubjective or romantic orientation, given romance as kind of the paradigmatic relationship, where the self emerges from recognition in relationships. And I relied principally on object relation psychoanalytic feminism, which was doing some really exciting stuff then, and it enabled me to kind of bring back psychoanalysis, but within an intersubjective approach rather than from this formal objective approach. I argued that freedom wasn't a fact, as the existentialists argued, and it wasn't an illusion, as Freud and the evolutionary psychologist argued, but that it was a power that could be fed by self-confidence, which in turn is fed by recognition. And the feeling that what you do matters, which is what recognition is. It's recognizing what you've done, right? If you don't get recognition, why bother? Is kind of the argument. So that was kind of the way I taught human nature, these four voices. When I returned from doctoral studies, Freud had fallen on hard times. He was not a scientist in that he didn't do statistical studies. He didn't follow what he disparaged as the American method of looking at large groups of people. He did focused case studies where he applies this system to a particular case. So it was deductive and objective. It wasn't inductive and impartial at all. So you have the point that, I don't know, there's a number of people in the psych department who will say this: Freud was a fraud, right? So I walked away from Freud. I spent a day on him, but I used to spend a month on him. And instead, what I put into that month was some history, because it was very painfully clear to me that the one way that my course was distinguished from every other human nature course, pretty much, was that I didn't do any history. I did only contemporary theories that I thought had legitimacy today, right? Because I wanted my students to think about theories that people actually were arguing for right now. So what I did is I went to Plato. I did Plato's Republic, and I did Descartes' Meditations. And then I went to evolutionary psychology and existentialism. And then I ended with romanticism, but I shifted away from psychoanalytic feminism. I kept some of the stuff I thought was really good, but I didn't spend days and days and days on it, to Charles Taylor's work that focuses more on the logic of recognition and social recognition, the ethics of recognition, he calls his ethics. So that's what I was doing in the late 1990s when I returned from doctoral studies. But in 2002, I took over the honors program. And I had this senior honors philosophy seminar. And I thought, wouldn't it be cool, having taken critical thinking and human nature and ethics, if rather than taking another class about philosophy, that they would take a class where they do philosophy. So that was my inspiration. And then the question was, okay, so what would be a good field for students to philosophize about? And it occurred to me that a new field about which there was virtually no received wisdom yet, and about which they're the experts and I'm the student, was the internet and what I call virtual technologies, which are internet-enabled technologies. At that time, 2002, remember, the internet isn't even 10 years old, right? And smartphones and social media haven't come about yet. So these are very early days. And the only books written on this stuff was what I call travelogues that would just say, look at this, oh my God, look at this, oh my God. You know, look at all this crazy stuff we can do. Nobody was thinking of, well, what's the implications of this? You know, what are the implications for the human condition of some of these new technologies? Being able to speak, being able to communicate anywhere in the world instantaneously and interactively. What difference does that make? Nobody was really thinking that through yet. It was just too young. It was just too new. In fact, it's still the case. I heard recently that philosophy of technology people can't get a session at the American Philosophical Association because it's just not serious philosophy. Right? It's like basket weaving. It's just too new to be a serious topic of reflection. It's weird. And for sure, there are no doctoral programs in the philosophy of technology that I'm aware of. I don't even know if there's any master's programs in the philosophy of technology, except in the Netherlands. So that's how new this is. And so the idea that these kids would reflect philosophically on these technologies where there was no place they could look to find the answers, they had to think it through for themselves. That was the exciting thing. Well, over time, Besmer and I taught this course with Kirk Besmer. So I wanted the team teach it. So I linked it to a junior honors colloquium. So that's two courses that were linked. And he would be the instructor of record for one course, and I would be the instructor of record for the other course. And we teach them both together. He's a phenomenologist. I'm a hermeneutical thinker. We have our differences. So we've been doing it ever since. And like I say, it's now both of our identities, this philosophy of technology. We were both seduced by the philosophy of technology. And what I've done is I have made it the organizing principle of all my classes. So with varying degrees of success, I tried to teach a critical thinking course with a technological bent, where we'd look at visual persuasion, oral persuasion, literate logical arguments, and then virtual procedural persuasion, where you persuade people by having them do things, like play a video game to learn something. There's some really cool social justice video games. But that didn't work out that well. I think I was way too ambitious, and I think I left my kids behind about 3 weeks into the course. didn't float very well. However, it's been much more successful in teaching the philosophy of religion to look at the coevolution of religion and technology, because after all, there is a difference between oral religion and literate religion, and we got to figure out how we move religion online. So, that's been my most successful adaptation, is to the philosophy of religion. But I also apply it to human nature, and that's been pretty successful too. So the sub-theme of my course is the co-evolution of humanity and its technologies. After all, we are a technological species. Technology predates Homo sapiens. It starts deeper into our past. The invention of tools, the domestication of fire, those both predate Homo sapiens, and they transformed hominid ways of life. Homo sapien, the killer app for Homo sapiens is speech. It's speech that allowed them to outcompete the Neanderthalers and the other Homo erectus cousins. Not because they killed them all, they just outcompeted them for resources. Good old evolution at work. So what I do in the course is I start with memetic communication. Memetics comes from the Greek word mimesis, from which we get imitate, right? So memetic communication is where you communicate by having somebody imitate you. So imitate behaviors. You don't need language to do that. Imitate feelings. You don't need language to do that either, although sometimes it helps. We feel what we perceive other people to be feeling. We imitate others' feelings. Just go to a GU basketball game, right? Feelings are contagious in the human species. Those good old neural neurons. Then there is speech, oral communication. Oh, let me stop. So imitation, it extends beyond behavior to feelings. It extends to desires. Most religious traditions will tell you that most everything you want because you see other people want it. You're just imitating their desires. If these people weren't there, you might not have wanted it in the first place. That's what advertising banks on. And then we also imitate violence, right? You hit me, I'm going to hit you back. So we imitate all kinds of things. And we are the most imitative species on the planet. We put apes to shame. We talk about aping people. We imitate a lot more than monkeys do. Because we're able to capture the attention of other people. Right? Try to capture the attention of a monkey. Right? They're going to be looking all over the place. Right? Try to capture the attention of a baby. Not that hard. Not that hard. Speech evolves. Perhaps the last biological adaptation is the evolution of speech. Speech is face-to-face dialogue and storytelling. You can only communicate with the people within earshot, and only if you get their attention, right? So speech has to be dramatic to get people's attention, and it has to be memorable so they remember it. If people forget what you say, it's gone. Right? Doesn't do you any good. And if you forget what you say, it's really gone. Right? So oral wisdom tends to be embedded in stories, which are easier to remember. They tend to be embedded in aphorisms and kind of, snappy sayings. Just think of jokes or advertising jingles, right? Things that are sometimes hard to get out of your mind, or song lyrics. Identity in oral culture is communal. You are who people say you are. your reputation is everything. If you have a bad reputation, people aren't going to cooperate with you. You're going to die because you can't live on your own. So it's an honor shame culture. Good reputation is crucial. In fact, there's one theorist who I think people are kind of getting behind, who's arguing that language may have evolved from gossip, that may have evolved from grooming rituals that became linguistic rituals, that became learning who to trust and who not to trust, right? So gossip is perhaps more important than we give it credit for. Now, within oral culture, you've got those original ancestral hunter-gatherers. But then you have the domestication of prey into herds and the domestication of what we gather into plants. So we domesticate plants, we domesticate our prey, and we become herders and farmers. And in becoming a herder and farmer, we end up domesticating ourselves too. Because if you're gonna farm, you're gonna have to stick around. Otherwise, somebody else will just take what you planted, right? And if you herd, you don't have to run around so much. Your prey is like right there. So with herding and farming, you also get sedentary village life. And the sacred, in other words, what's most important to you, what defines the meaning of your life shifts from wild prey and rituals where you are possessed by the spirit of your prey, maybe through magic mushrooms or other things, or through ecstatic dances. It shifts from the shamanic wild to fertility. Because now fertility matters. The fertility of your herds, the fertility of your fields, and the fertility of your women. Think about it. In a hunter-gatherer society, kids are a burden. They could be slowing you down. In a farm, kids are an asset. They can help you work. There are things even little kids can do on a farm. And the sacred also becomes domesticated. You start having not just these huge bonfires, but rituals around the home hearth. You have family gods and divinities. In fact, the word focus in Latin comes from its word for hearth. The next big revolution is literacy. And with literacy, you can communicate with people beyond earshot. Because with literacy, it's not a performance, it's the production of an object, a text that you can then carry to somebody else. It starts with large-scale irrigation that requires beginning to keep track of all this grain you're growing, right? In Neolithic cultures, it's all communal. You have communal storehouses. People eat what they need. There's no reason to eat more than you need. And there's no reason to hoard because you can't protect it from other people anyway. You don't have locks on your doors. You don't have guards. The minute you turn your back, somebody else might be getting some of it. How could you prove it? How could you even know that you're missing something? Unless you can count it. So literacy probably starts with counting, with numbers. And then quickly to contracts, which are trades beyond earshot. We have to write it down. what the deal is. But once you start getting excess grain, and then add to that the introduction of bronze, which is great for making weapons, right? Now you begin to get resource inequality, right? I can hoard stuff and keep you from getting it. In fact, I can give grain to some other guys and have them join me to take your grain. I can build little militias and start raiding other people's grain. Or villages can start raiding other people's villages. And not just raid them, but conquer them and take their people and enslave them so that they have to do what you want them to do. That's all possible with bronze, right? That's all possible when you got weapons and you got a surplus that you can pay soldiers with. So Neolithic culture is largely egalitarian, it's largely peaceful. Early Bronze Age culture, it's rife with violence. Violence becomes endemic. And what becomes sacred now is the social order, preserving the order of society, which is always on the verge of breakup, either slave revolts or other cities conquering your city, or it's just like it's a very fragile social order. And so you have rituals that try to sanctify that social order. And those first literate people are scribes. And it's a very small group because literacy is very hard to learn unless it's a phonetic alphabet. You've got hundreds and hundreds of characters you need to learn. And you don't have paper. So the medium is relatively scarce. So in the beginning, with scribal literacy, what you have is a small elite that are basically the bureaucrats for the temple and the court. And their job is to transcribe what's told to them, either transcribing oral stories that have been going through the town forever, or transcribing royal decrees, or transcribing correspondence between political actors, or transcribing contracts between traders. But notice this early stage of literacy, the medium is now permanent, but the content is still oral. It's oral content made permanent. It's just an enhancement of orality. But with the alphabetization of script, it becomes a lot easier to learn. You don't have to learn hundreds and hundreds of different symbols. You have a limited repertoire of symbols, and if you don't know the word, you can just sound it out because it's a phonetic alphabet rather than a pictographic or an alphabet or a, what do you call it? An alphabet where a symbol stands for an idea. Now a symbol stands for a sound. So you can kind of sound it out. And as you sound it out, you say, oh yeah, I know that word, you know? So it's a lot easier to learn to read. And with alphabetization, I argue, that's one way, it's not the only way, but it's one way in which you begin to get literate people outside of court and temple who maybe are alienated from court and temple, and so become critical of society, critical of social traditions, rather than just legitimating them. And so you get the birth of critical thinking. You get the birth of this is often called the axial revolution, where it's not just the medium that's literate, the content now is literate. You're not just writing down what somebody tells you to write down. You're writing down your own thoughts, your own questions, your own critiques. And this is where literacy really starts taking off, because now it's fully literate. Whereas scribal literacy is more of a hybrid. Now we got full literacy. And with full literacy, you get a shift from communal identity to individual identity. Because now what matters is what you think and what you think. And you can record what you think. And you can record your own experiences, your own desires, your own feelings. And so rather than just these dramatic stories about superheroes, we can now start having stories about me and stories about people like me. And so what happens with literacy is you get this intensification of both objectivity and subjectivity. Objectivity, because now you can be critical of what everybody knows is right. Okay? And now you need to argue for what you believe, rather than just say, well, everybody knows that. Okay? Which works if you know it, if you can remember it. Now it's like remembering it isn't enough. You got to be able to prove it. So you get radicalized objectivity, but you also get radicalized subjectivity. Because as I start tracking my own thoughts and desires, I start noticing patterns that may be unique to me. I start developing an individual story rather than simply my story in light of Heracles' story. Right? And print just exponentializes all this because it extends literacy to the entire urban population, pretty much. Right? Now, all kinds of people are reading and writing and creating identities and observing data and recording data, which would have been too trivial to waste valuable vellum on. You now have paper, which is relatively cheap. And so with this radicalization of objectivity and subjectivity, you get the rise of science, which is based on impartial, detached observation and looking for patterns among a large array of data, where you have naturalists who start drawing pictures of all the things they're seeing, rather than just focusing on the archetypes, right? They start drawing the individual pictures. And you have, which is, I mean, drawing these pictures is no good if the scribe has to reproduce the picture. But once you can print the picture, now you can cook with gas, right? Now you can disseminate your pictures. So you get the rise of science in the sense of radically detached impersonal observation of data and finding patterns in the data. But it also leads to the intensification of subjectivity. And so you have both romanticism and you have this first person idealism, where you're looking at the world from the point of view of me. You're looking at the world from my point of view. At this point in the course, then, I stop and I take 2 weeks to look at a scientific approach to human nature. So here we are with this radically objective approach, and look at evolutionary psychology, my old friend. And then we look at a radically subjective approach, and I look at existentialism again, my old friend. So these different orientations to reality, I'm now saying, are evolving from this technological development. Orality is dialogical, it's second person. With print, you have a differentiation of objective and subjective ways of thinking. And then the last month of the course, I turned to the internet and virtual communication. And I ask, so what's the difference between a text and a hypertext? What difference does it make if I can interact with somebody on the other side of the planet anytime I want, pretty much for free. And now we have a media that includes voice and text, but it includes a bunch of other things too. It includes videos. It includes three-dimensional objects. It includes virtual reality. And I want to argue this changes not just how we reason, but how we understand ourselves, our identities, and what we hold sacred. And that's what I'm really most interested in exploring. How are those changing with this new technology that's still less than 30 years old, right? So I don't see myself answering these questions. I may see myself beginning to ask these questions and try to get people to think about these questions. It might take a couple hundred years to know how to use social media properly without it just destroying people's psyches. But to drive home, so reasoning, so knowledge, the definition of knowledge, I think, is changing from what you can prove to what you can access and use effectively, right? In your math and science classes, are you able to use calculators? In my generation, that would have been cheating. In this generation, it's like, you got to be able to do the goddamn problems, and you got to know how to do them. You got to know how to find the resources to do the problem. Identity shifts from an individual private self, this authentic self that shouldn't give a damn about when anybody else thinks of them, not an oral self, but a literate self, a private individual, to now, I think identity is moving to a networked notion, where we are a network of persona that we enact on all these different platforms. And our audiences on all these platforms are different, so that I can be different without getting called out, right? I mean, my followers on Facebook aren't my followers on Tinder, so maybe I can be different people. And they're probably not the guys I play, Fortnite with, my Fortnite group, right? So I can start playing with my identity. I can have different identities, hopefully within reason, but different identities. So we move from having, say, you have to be a single self, you got to be authentic, you got to be integrate, you got to have integrity, you got to be one thing, to this network of persona model. So the demons shift. The demons, say, of Freud's day was neurosis and overwork. The demons of industrial capitalism that chew people up. The demons of the existentialist is bad faith, lying to yourself, not being true to yourself, not being the same person in different contexts. The demons of the network self are, this is a list I've got right now: fragmentation, dissociating who I am on one platform from who I am on the other platform. That's not me when I'm on Instagram. Oh, you got this great example of a kid who harassed, this is a high school kid who harassed another high school kid on her Facebook page, but then then they would cross one another in school, and the kid was just upset that the other kid would take the argument into real life. It's like, that's on Facebook. That's not me. That's Facebook. So fragmentation. So dissociation rather than repression. Paranoia. In other words, anxiety is about being monitored and manipulated. Right? Conspiracy theories are the name of the game today. It's speaking to that demon of the virtual self. Dependency on the very technologies that enable us to live these lives of ours. Right? So the fear that I lose my cell phone and I'm a dead man, right? Whereas 30 years ago, I didn't have a cell phone and it didn't seem to bother me. Right? So I become more dependent on my technologies. At least that's the fear. And then finally, superficiality, by which I mean it's breadth at the expense of depth, right? So in my day, when I was writing a research paper, I would look at maybe 5 or 6 sources and I would read those sources from beginning to end and analyze their arguments. Most of it was a waste of time, but that was the process I had to go through. Now I can go on a database and search for 100 different articles and search and do word searches within each article and find just what I'm interested in, isolate it from the rest of the article. And so I've got breadth like nobody's business, but I'm not learning their arguments that much. Right? So there's fears by literate people that you guys can't think deeply. Right? So let me conclude by where I started. The truth is to be had by lying together many varieties of error. So just as I had argued in my earlier human nature class that there are these 4 different orientations to reality, kind of logical attitudes, they're equally comprehensive. There's nothing they can't explain in their own terms. And one is no substitute for the other. And reality, it's just this harmonic creative tension. It's kind of like a kaleidoscopic reality. Okay? You can engage the world in a lot of different ways, and how you engage it shapes what you get from it. So now I'm looking at how, as technology evolves, we develop different understandings of who we are, different understandings of what the world is, different moralities, different ways of thinking. But it's not like each supersedes the last one. Because when I started reading, I didn't stop talking. And as I go online, it's not like books are going to disappear. It's easier than ever to publish. Just as when I read books, I've got more to talk about than ever. Right? So it's more like layers on an onion. Right? And you still have this kind of harmonic creative tension. You know, I want to have an interior life, but that's not my whole identity now. My identity is also all these persona that I enact on all these different platforms with all these different people, many of whom I've never met face to face. Right? And what I want to work with my students on is, what do you make of this? You know, what do you make of this? How do you craft a meaningful life given this technological landscape? And I don't think the answers are already determined. It's just too early in the day. I can talk forever. I'll stop here.
What I'd like is let's proceed to questions, and you can direct questions to either or both of our speakers. So the floor is open. That's the last.
Oh, by the way, I use evolution as an alternative to development. I don't want to talk about the development of technology because that does entail I want to say the history of technological invention is contingent, and we can't predict it in advance. Aristotle couldn't have predicted smartphones, and I probably can't predict what the next revolution is, although I've got my suspicions.
What are your suspicions?
Telepathy, brain-to-brain communication. Being able to have a neural uplink in your head that allows you to access Google by just thinking about it. Now, you might wonder whether that's worth the effort, right? But when I try to think out of the box, that's the next box I think of. Or just uploading into a virtual reality altogether, right? Uploading your consciousness. If that's possible.
Dr. Alfino, you mentioned ways in which you thought Father Clancy was using evolution in a completely different way than you are. Can you maybe speak to that?
Yeah, sure. I think I enjoyed the talk quite a bit.
Well, it's not random mutation. Absolutely.
Yeah. So what I was thinking of while I was listening to your talk was how much your work involves talking about how forms of culture interact with each other, and that sounds interesting and fruitful. I don't know, for instance, if the literacy story really goes the way you're describing it in reality.
No, I've read a bunch of books.
Yeah.
You give me books that give me a counter story.
Yeah. Well, that's when you're working within a field where of cultural interpretation, where you're comparing stories and you're looking for insights. I think evolution is a little different than that. So I was reminded of 19th century models like Ernst Cassirer and Hegel, where you're thinking of evolution as the unfolding of something, maybe not teleological. I'm still not sure about that.
Oh, it is. I mean, Hegel.
Yeah,
Definitely
Hegel, to
teleological.
the extent that I'm still not sure to the extent that what you're doing is teleological, but let me just finish my point. I mean, that's all very, that's an interesting and probably very fruitful way to talk metaphorically about forms of culture interacting with each other. That's certainly not a theory. I don't know that you really are trying to do it.
This is not a scientific theory.
Well,
I explain how science evolves, just like you explain how my theories evolve. But I'm not saying this is really just science. I'm saying no, science is one limited domain. It's one way to understand reality. It's not the only. And sometimes it's not the best.
right, I'm certainly with you, looking for insights wherever you can find them. I'm certainly not going to be picky about that. But I will say that scientific theories aren't just theories that touch on objective matter. They come with it. But evolutionary theory comes out of something.
It's universal. There's nothing science can't study. Absolutely. And have theories. The question is it satisfying? Is it answering the questions that you're asking?
The last thing I'll say, I'd like to get some questions from the audience, comments from the audience. The last thing I'll say in this general way is I kept listening in your talk, I kept waiting to hear some mention of existence, as if existence was part of what we're really interacting with. But instead, most of the account was about how one change in the form of culture led to another change, and existence and meeting the demands of existence never really came up.
There's no non-interpretable level. I'm a hermeneutical thinker. There's no immediate access to anything. It's always interpretable.
Right. Well, do you think that we are actually trying to meet existential challenges in this world?
Absolutely.
Well,
But existential isn't the same as what you meant by existence. Existential is like life and death issues. Yeah, absolutely.
I would say that evolutionary theories are more directed toward the kinds of existential problems that affect whether we get into the next generation that I do.
Okay.
I think it's a healthy difference. I just want to point it out.
Yeah.
And that's what I wondered about at the beginning. I just don't think that you're doing evolution in that sense.
I'm not doing science. Absolutely.
pick up over the lure of the projector.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you.
I'm trying to figure out how to phrase this to say.
Yeah.
But you're talking about cultural evolution and how that has changed how we picture ourselves as human beings.
Right.
But has that social evolution always, like the way that we define human nature, always been written by like hegemonic majority, or can our definitions of human nature be written by those who have been historically oppressed?
That's really interesting. You can imagine cultures you can imagine cultures, especially democratic cultures, that make it more likely that the change makers can be people who are not the most powerful. So I guess my shortest answer would be it may be a contingent feature of a human culture, whether it allows change only from allows proposal, only from powerful elites, or whether people at the street level can make change. And that's not where your question is. And so I would say that that's a feature of the culture. And so cultures that if you think cultures do better, and we don't know until sometime goes by, if you think cultures survive and thrive better if they allow change makers to come from non-powerful classes, then that would be a feature of culture that would have evolutionary spirit. That would be my bet. I don't know if that's your bet. That we'll do better going into the future if we listen to the press.
So I think that like you were focusing on that essential question on climate change. I think that is really important. Facing that threat, such as having indigenous people be able to have some economy, and then also because people in power be looking after their own well-being versus the productive well-being,
Right.
Which we're seeing like oil and tax and everything like that. It makes me wonder if it is in human nature intrinsically to allow for cultural evolution to come primarily from.
Yeah, I would steer away from that. The idea that there's an antecedent human nature that governs what can happen.
Yeah.
There are limits. So like I was saying, there are things we can make, there are places we might not get to. It's too far in design space for us to get to there. But I wouldn't say there's kind of some antecedent human nature that controls what's possible in evolution. I would say at any stage of evolution, we have a nature, set of possibilities, a mentality, a brain size, and those things all affect what's possible going into the next generation. Yeah, great question.
And I would say the early promise of the internet was that marginal groups could network and create these alternative political movements, and that would work around the gatekeepers. Now, there's been kind of a mixed history of that. Didn't work so well for the Arabs in the Arab Spring, at least for most Arab countries.
So you don't see Facebook as one of the gatekeepers.
Well, the early days of the internet was that they're not going to be. But that's part of as our understanding matures, we learn that these guys are not neutral conveyors of media.
More questions, comments?
I'll just ask you a question.
Yeah.
You referred to this idea that there are multiple people on many
Right.
platforms. I don't know.
Persona, which are partial,
Yeah.
partial selves.
I don't know too many people who do that. Do you know a lot of people who do that?
Every student I ever taken says who they are on Facebook is not who they are on Tinder, is not who they are on their work email, is not who they are when they're playing World of Warcraft.
I must be out of step. I'm trying to be consistent.
Oh boy, that's going to get you in a lot of trouble.
Do we get a general?
You're gonna get pretty hard.
Have you guys fractured your identity over? Are you very different people in different places?
Now, there's the danger of fragmentation, right? So I think these views, I think these different persona should be talking to one another, and we should resist the temptation of dissociating one persona from another, saying like, when I get drunk, that's not the sober me, and the sober me shouldn't be responsible for who I am when I'm drunk. So too, who I am in real life, who I am when I'm face to face with you, should bear some responsibility to who I am when I'm interacting with you on Instagram. But we're not necessarily the same people in some deep sense, right? I mean, we're part of the same network.
Along those lines, people even have different personas on a certain social platform.
Oh yeah,
So-
Instagram.
Yeah, so people could have 3 or 4 accounts on Instagram that all display a certain type of person that they are, that are completely different from one another, because they don't want certain people to fit in certain which is
And so to me, the killer question is, for the literate person, is, so which one is the real you, and which of these are just masks and roles that you're playing? And that's a question without an answer, right? I mean, the real you is all of it.
laying into your last statement, that the real use all of it. That brings us to the question with relevant fragmentation of if there is a true single self, or we're all multiplicities.
We're networks. We're networks within networks.
I'm behind, terribly behind.
Well, it's made by day, Mark, that
Yeah.
I can say something, and
Yeah.
you say, oh my God, I've never heard of that.
One of the questions is this how substantive a change is this?
Well,
Right, let's look at roots. I'm a different person in this room than I am in my bedroom with my lover, than I am in a classroom teaching, than I am in a club downtown or at a restaurant. I mean, is the difference that the media offers, how significant?
That's the question. Yeah, I agree. My money is on, this is not a literate modern identity. This is something else. And it's got different needs and different psychological stresses than Freud's ego did. Or that an oral self has, for whom honor shame is the need.
I wonder if a critical question, and I'm sure we can't answer this in the couple of minutes we have left, but there's an interesting question about which of your views incorporates the other.
But we both
because-
incorporate one another.
Yeah, so, I mean, Mark, you're gonna say that, in fact, you did say that part of what you find at least wanting with Tim's approach is that it downplays the biological foundation. Is that not a right way to put it?
No, I think, I'm a little, I'm not really sure about my original impression now that I first talked. I think Tim's doing cultural interpretation. I don't think it has to be tied to the evolutionary period. You can use the word evolution to talk metaphorically about how technologies affect each other and us. And I think that's all very important. I wouldn't put a negative judgment on that at all. I think it's really important to also have a theory that we can call knowledge, not just interpretation, which is a true theory about where it came from. And I don't think the story, the narrative that you're giving was attempting to do that. Tell me if I'm wrong.
Well, I mean, and you and I have gone back and forth on this, and on we've known one. That when you say this is true, I ask, really true, as opposed to only scientifically true.
Yeah,
Oh,
yeah.
As
I
if-
don't know.
as if-
I live in a world where if your kids have ear infections, you take them to the doctor. Because I'm pretty sure that doctors have truth about ear infections.
And I live in a world where if the doctor tells me there's nothing more they can do, that doesn't mean there's nothing more I can do.
Sure, but
Might not be anything more medically. I
Tim,
can
I
do.
assure you that if you had kids, and I should be home, if you had kids.
Safe assumption.
Yeah, don't go into that now. you had kids and women had their infections, you would go to a shaman, you would go to a doctor.
Oh, no, I'm not a Christian Scientist. No.
Well, the larger point is, there is something called knowledge. It may change, but it's not reducible to something called science, which is one story.
Well, there is scientific knowledge. There's also knowing a person, which is personal knowledge, which is not scientific knowledge.
Yes.
And there's also,
there's faith knowledge. I give you all that, but
okay,
but
but
knowledge-
somehow scientific knowledge is like knowledge with a capital K, as opposed to other knowledge with a small.
yeah, I'm not really trying to do that.
Oh, okay.
I think there's some things that we know to be true. We may be wrong.
Scientifically.
Yeah, it sounds like you're more interested in putting a reductive qualifier on it.
Well, you're the one that says if it's scientific, then it's true in some sense that a poem isn't true.
It's explanatory, and poems can be
Yeah.
explanatory. They can explain things about us and each other, but not in.
Now,
in the
see,
sense that-
I'm not really interested in explaining things. I'm interested in understanding. So that Naturwissenschaft versus Geisteswissenschaft, I'm a big believer that there's a distinction.
Right.
And
Well,
that
you're-
neither of them
Tim, you're 19th
is
you're 19th
reducible to
century
the other.
scholar.
Neither of them is reducible to the other.
Big surprise, you're a 19th century scholar, and the two figures that you reminded me of, you were talking to, both 19th century scholars.
And yet I'm telling you things that you've never heard before. So that maybe that should make you really scared. If a 19th century person is telling you things that you've never heard of before.
No, that's fine. I just.
I'd say I'm a
I would
21st
encourage
century
you- I would encourage the audience to kind of think about whether you do have the distinction you make every day in these things about who goes to based on whether they actually have knowledge, not just a story to tell. Sometimes you do go to people because they have a story to tell. Doesn't mean to read a book. But I would not try, I think it would be really dangerous to try to face the distinction between knowledge and things that, objective knowledge and things that are other kinds of knowledge. Like
I'm
personal
just
knowledge.
making distinctions. You're the one that seems to want to put a hierarchy on these things. Okay, I don't want a priest building bridges. But I don't want an engineer doing my wedding.
I want to know where we came from, and I don't think your story tells us that. Let's just put it that way. I just think your story might have other values for us, but it doesn't really tell us where we came from. The big news in literacy really had to do with Reformation. Sure.
Well, that's
morality and literacy.
that's print. But we start civilization with literacy. Right? Isn't civilization a big deal? Isn't cities a big deal? It's a lot different than hunter-gatherers. And that's writing. And I want to argue that, or what I'm exploring, is whether the internet is a revolution as significant as work of writing.
I think that's a really important thing to explore and offer interpretations
Yeah.
about it. Yeah, that's fine. I think that's great.
I'm afraid we are out of time. Let's thank our speakers, please.